For 14 straight days, a specific sector of the Ukrainian front line simply ceased to function. Every time a localized supply convoy attempted to push forward or an infantry unit tried to rotate their exhausted personnel, pinpoint Russian artillery struck their coordinates. The incoming fire was not random, it was highly calculated, and it was devastatingly accurate. It was being directed from a newly excavated 600-meter trench network housing a heavily fortified, elevated observation post. Standard military doctrine dictates a specific solution for this problem. When an enemy establishes a heavily fortified observation node, you eliminate it with massed, sustained artillery. But in this sector, continuous counter-battery fire had completely failed. The Russian engineers had spent 7 days digging deep into the earth, reinforcing the trench walls with timber and overhead cover. Point-detonating artillery shells would simply shatter against the reinforced roofs, leaving the spotters inside untouched. The terrain remained entirely locked down, and the Ukrainian forces were bleeding out from a distance. So, Ukrainian commanders changed the tactical math entirely. Instead of attempting to level the grid square from several miles away, they sent 22 infantrymen into the dark. What happened over the next 47 minutes completely dismantled the Russian defensive node, neutralized 34 combatants, demolished the command bunker, and permanently blinded the artillery spotters. And they achieved all of this without suffering a single fatality. Understanding how a small, lightly armed unit achieved this requires looking past the basic casualty numbers. It requires examining the exact, unforgiving mechanics of modern infiltration. The operation did not begin with a physical breach. It began with 5 days of unblinking, relentless aerial surveillance. Ukrainian drone operators did not just map the dirt, the sandbags, and the communication saps of the trench line. They mapped the administrative habits of the men living inside it. Through high-resolution thermal imaging, the drone units tracked what the military calls the pattern of life. They logged the exact minute the guard rotations changed every single night. They counted the exact number of soldiers who slept in the primary bunker. They calculated the precise distance a Russian soldier would have to run from the sleeping quarters to reach their fighting position. Capturing this data was not just about knowing the enemy's physical location, it was about identifying the exact window of peak vulnerability. The drones observed that every night, without fail, there was a specific, momentary lapse in security during the guard transition. The outgoing sentries would leave their posts just moments before the incoming sentries arrived. If you've made it this far, I'm curious about your perspective. Who deserves more credit here? The drone operators who spent 5 days gathering this flawless intelligence? Or the 22 soldiers who executed the assault in the dark? Let me know in the comments. I read as many of them as I can because some of the best military discussions happen exactly there. But knowing the layout of a trench from a screen is largely useless when you are operating on the ground at night under extreme physiological stress. To bridge the massive gap between intelligence gathering and kinetic execution, Ukrainian planners took the drone telemetry and did something highly unconventional. They built an exact, 1-to-1 scale physical replica of the Russian earthworks at their own forward operating base. For days, the 22-man assault platoon ran full speed, live fire rehearsals through this mock-up. They memorized the angles. They practiced the geometry of the corners until the movement became pure muscle memory. They divided the platoon into 4 highly specialized teams, an entry element to handle the initial stealth breach, an explosives team to neutralize the heavy bunker, a sweep unit to eliminate the spotters, and a dedicated cover team equipped with electronic warfare devices. By the time they were ready to deploy, every single sector of fire was pre-assigned. The objective was to completely eliminate any need for verbal communication once they hit the hostile perimeter. Most channels will show you a 30-second combat clip and move on. We take a different approach. We break down how these operations actually happen, what worked, what failed, and why it matters to the broader conflict. If that's the kind of analysis you're looking for, consider subscribing. At 1:10 in the morning, the operation moved into the execution phase. The route from the Ukrainian forward line to the Russian trench entry point consisted of 380 meters of completely open ground. The 22-man platoon crossed this expanse in single file. It took them 22 minutes, moving at a highly cautious, agonizingly slow pace, dictated by the absolute need for silence. The early May night was relatively warm, and the ground had dried from the previous week's rain. This environmental factor severely reduced the noise of their footsteps on the approach. At 1:17, the infiltration went live. The Ukrainian cover team, remaining outside the trench, activated a localized electronic warfare jamming device. This severed the network's short-range radio communications. Jamming the frequencies was critical because it isolated the Russian defenders from their higher command. It prevented the Russian duty officer from calling in a localized artillery strike on his own coordinates, a standard defensive protocol when a trench is being overrun. Simultaneously, the cover team's thermal optics confirmed that the Russian guard rotation was currently transitioning at the first position, designated Alpha. The outgoing sentries were walking south, away from the perimeter, and the incoming guards had not yet settled into their firing positions. The Ukrainian entry team exploited this exact administrative gap. Slipping silently over the lip of the trench, they secured the first corner using suppressed weapons and cold steel. Capturing position Alpha silently was not just about reducing early casualties, it was a highly calculated delay tactic. Every single second that the general alarm was not sounded gave the heavier Ukrainian assault elements time to move deeper into the trench network toward the primary, heavily armored targets. But the stealth phase of the operation was always designed to be temporary. Moving aggressively toward the center of the network, the secondary assault element, Team Bravo, approached the primary Russian bunker. This structure held the duty officer, a radio operator, and 6 additional soldiers. It was the nerve center of the trench. Breaching a fortified bunker constructed to withstand artillery fire requires overwhelming, concussive violence. At 1:26, the silence officially shattered. The Bravo team engaged the bunker using the specific, brutal physics of trench warfare. When a fragmentation grenade is thrown around a 90-degree earthen corner, known as a traverse, the enclosed dirt walls immediately reflect the blast pressure inward. This drastically increases the lethal radius inside the corridor while preventing the fragmentation from scattering outward into the assaulting Ukrainian troops. This geometric advantage allowed the assault team to instantly clear the immediate approach. Not waiting for the dust to settle, they pushed through the blast window and placed a specialized frame charge directly onto the reinforced bunker door. Inside the structure, the Russian duty officer heard the grenade detonation and desperately reached for his radio. He had exactly 3 seconds. The frame charge detonated. The resulting overpressure wave blew the heavy door inward, instantly neutralizing the command element before the radio operator could broadcast a localized distress signal. 14 Russian soldiers were neutralized at position Bravo in a matter of moments. The command and control of the 600-meter trench line was completely decapitated. That violent breach, however, immediately created a new tactical problem. The massive explosions at the bunker alerted the 2 Russian artillery spotters stationed further north at position Charlie. This observation post was the entire reason the raid was happening. It was an elevated sandbag platform connected to the main line by a narrow 8-meter communication trench. Hearing the assault unfold at Bravo, the Russian spotters assumed a textbook defensive posture. They raised their weapons and aimed directly down the primary trench line, creating a classic fatal funnel. Any Ukrainian soldier moving directly into their line of sight would be walking into a wall of lead. This is exactly where the 5 days of drone surveillance dictated the final outcome of the firefight. The Ukrainian assault team had anticipated this specific structural advantage during their replica rehearsals. They understood that the spotters were watching the correct approach vector, but they were watching it at the wrong elevation. To bypass this choke point, the Ukrainian element executed a rapid split maneuver. 2 soldiers remained low in the primary trench, stepping out just far enough to lay down heavy suppressive fire upward. They fired at an oblique angle that the Russian engineers had completely failed to reinforce with sandbags. This suppression pinned the spotters in place, forcing them to keep their heads down and stripping away their visual advantage. While the spotters were suppressed by the covering fire, a 3rd Ukrainian soldier rapidly scaled the narrow communication trench. He closed the distance to the elevated platform in 4 seconds. The position was flanked, and the spotters were neutralized. The primary objective of the entire operation was achieved at 1:41. If you enjoy detailed battlefield analysis and want to see more real military operations broken down step by step, leave a like on the video. It helps more people discover this type of content and tells the algorithm that there is an audience for serious tactical breakdowns. With the spotters eliminated, the operation shifted from kinetic action to technical exploitation. Sitting on the elevated platform was a tripod-mounted Russian thermal camera. It was still powered on. Instead of simply putting a bullet through the lens and destroying it, the squad's intelligence specialists rapidly detached the intact unit from its mount. Recovering this specific piece of optical hardware was a massive intelligence victory, arguably more valuable than the trench itself. Capturing enemy hardware intact allows military technicians to download its stored data. It reveals the exact thermal parameters, the frequency bands it operates on, and the technical limitations of the enemy's surveillance network. By analyzing this single camera, Ukrainian electronic warfare units can develop better countermeasures, ultimately saving lives across entirely different sectors of the front. The intelligence specialist secured the device in a matter of 15 seconds. By this point, less than 25 minutes had passed since the initial breach. 34 enemy combatants were accounted for, the spotters were blind, the camera was secured. But a trench is only captured if you can hold it, and the Ukrainian platoon had no intention of staying to face the inevitable Russian artillery counter-barrage that would rain down at sunrise. The platoon was already setting delayed demolition charges on the wooden structural supports of the bunkers and the observation platform. At 1:54, the entire 22-man assault force crossed back over the trench wall and began the 380-meter return movement. The pace was faster now, driven by a hard deadline. The delayed demolition charges set at Bravo were timed to detonate at exactly 2:10. At 2:04, the platoon crossed back over the Ukrainian forward line. Every single soldier was accounted for. The medical debrief revealed a highly efficient, almost flawless execution. Only 3 soldiers sustained minor injuries, 1 cut from contact with the trench wall, and 2 with minor bruising from the concussive blast pressure of the breaching charges. Absolutely 0 men required medical evacuation. They were fully combat effective the next morning. When dawn broke, a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone flew over the sector to confirm the devastation. The delayed charges had functioned perfectly, the massive bunker roofs were broken, the earth cover had caved into the interior, and the observation platform at Charlie was reduced to a useless pile of fill material. This structural demolition was a critical secondary objective. It ensured that the Russian military could not simply send a new squad of spotters to re-garrison the position the next day. They would have to rebuild the entire network from scratch, under the watchful eyes of Ukrainian drones. The logistics and economics of this operation demonstrate a highly efficient expenditure of resources. The Ukrainian military utilized roughly $60,000 in drone surveillance, electronic warfare equipment, breaching charges, and suppressed ammunition. In return, they achieved a physical destruction ratio of 40-1. More importantly, they permanently silenced the artillery network that had bled their sector dry for 2 straight weeks. This operation is a clear indicator of how modern conflict is evolving. The integration of continuous, high-definition drone surveillance with highly rehearsed, surgical infantry maneuvers can dismantle static defenses far more effectively than traditional massed artillery. Firepower alone does not win complex engagements. Pristine intelligence, absolute patience, and precise human execution do. Thousands of people watch these military breakdowns every day, but only a small percentage are subscribed. If you appreciate the time and research that goes into explaining these operations in plain English, without the hype or the Hollywood dramatization, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel continue producing this type of content. And while military academies will dissect the anatomy of this operation for years to come, defensive doctrines on both sides are already shifting. Armies are learning that overhead cover and deep trenches are no longer enough to guarantee safety. To understand how trench networks are actively being redesigned and hardened to survive the next evolution of infantry infiltration, watch the next tactical breakdown on your screen. The 47-minute raid that completely dismantled a Russian observation post was not just a localized tactical defeat for Moscow. It was a massive diagnostic failure of their entire defensive doctrine. When a 22-man Ukrainian assault force can infiltrate a heavily fortified trench, neutralize 34 combatants, and extract without a single casualty, it sends a shockwave through the opposing military command. The Russian engineering units had spent over a week building a textbook defense. They had depth, they had overhead timber cover, and they had established firing lines. But the Ukrainian military proved that none of that physical infrastructure matters if the enemy holds absolute surveillance supremacy. The realization that physical fortifications are functionally useless when your pattern of life is exposed has triggered a rapid, aggressive evolution in how defensive lines are being constructed on both sides of the conflict. The cat-and-mouse game between drone operators and trench engineers has escalated into a brutal new phase. The unwritten rules of static warfare have completely changed, and armies are now actively redesigning their earthworks to survive the era of pristine, high-definition intelligence. If you followed this far, I am curious about your perspective on this shift. Do you think traditional trench warfare is fundamentally obsolete in the age of thermal drones? Or are we simply witnessing a temporary technological imbalance that engineers will eventually solve? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The debate around the survivability of infantry in modern conflict is one of the most important discussions happening right now, and I try to read as many of your insights as possible. To understand how trenches are evolving, we first have to look at how the Russian military is attempting to solve their most glaring vulnerability: thermal predictability. The Ukrainian infiltration succeeded because drones mapped the exact guard rotations and sleeping arrangements using thermal optics. To counter this, Russian infantry units are completely abandoning fixed schedules. The concept of a standard guard shift has been eliminated in highly contested sectors. Instead, commanders are implementing randomized, staggered rotations. A guard might stand post for 40 minutes, then 2 hours, then 15 minutes. The objective is to scramble the telemetry data so that Ukrainian drone operators can never establish a reliable timeline for an assault. But changing a schedule does not hide the thermal signature of a human body. When a drone looks down at a trench at 2 in the morning, the heat radiating from a command bunker glows bright white against the cold earth. To mitigate this, defensive engineers are rethinking overhead cover. They are no longer just using timber and dirt to stop artillery shrapnel. They are utilizing specialized thermal absorbent netting and mylar-lined space blankets buried beneath the soil. By insulating the roofs of the bunkers, they trap the heat inside the dugout, preventing the thermal differential from bleeding out into the open air. If a drone cannot see the heat concentration, it cannot tell the assault team which bunker holds the command element and which bunker is completely empty. This introduces a completely new tactical problem for the attacking force, the weaponization of deception. Because thermal signatures can now be masked, Russian units have begun constructing highly elaborate decoy bunkers. These are fully excavated dugouts, reinforced with timber, that look exactly like primary command nodes. But inside, instead of troops, the engineers place crude heat sources, sometimes just smoldering coals and metal drums, or simple battery-powered thermal emitters.